On the chilling afternoon of December 10, 2022, the pristine green turf of the Al Thummama Stadium in Qatar became the final, tragic graveyard for one of the most physically gifted and extraordinarily expensive collections of football talent ever assembled in the history of the modern game. As the final whistle blew, sealing a shocking, historic 1-0 victory for Morocco in the World Cup quarterfinals, the global television cameras did not focus on the celebrating African players. Instead, the lenses zoomed in on a deeply moving, symbolic portrait of absolute generational failure. Cristiano Ronaldo, the undisputed king of Portuguese sports and the highest-scoring international male footballer of all time, was captured walking completely alone down the concrete tunnel, his face buried in his large hands as hot, uncontrollable tears streamed down his cheeks. Behind him on the pitch stood a roster of multi-million-dollar superstars who were actively dominating the elite ranks of the English Premier League, the Spanish La Liga, and the Italian Serie A. Men like Bruno Fernandes, the creative engine of Manchester United, Bernardo Silva, the tactical genius anchoring Pep Guardiola's Manchester City, Ruben Dias, arguably the most dominant central defender in Europe, and João Felix, a player who once commanded a transfer fee of over 120 million euros. By any logical sporting metric, a nation possessing this specific density of footballing royalty should have breezed through the tournament, playing a style of expansive, beautiful football that would strike absolute terror into the hearts of any opposition. Yet, on that fateful winter afternoon, Portugal did not look like an unstoppable global superpower. Instead, they looked like a completely disconnected, fragmented, and creatively paralyzed amontonamento of famous individuals who could not break down a stubborn, highly organized defensive block. This agonizing exit was not an isolated tactical anomaly, but rather the devastating culmination of a long, painful multi-year paradox that has left millions of passionate football fans across the globe asking the exact same burning question. How did a nation with such an abundance of riches manage to completely waste its greatest footballing generation? Before we dissect the hidden systemic errors, the toxic dressing room politics, and the rigid tactical philosophies that combine to shackle this golden squad, do me a massive favor. If you believe that international football is won through collective chemistry rather than just gathering big names on a team sheet, hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the like button to support the channel, and leave a comment below sharing exactly who you think is to blame for Portugal's recent international underachievements. We actively monitor the comments, so join the archive community down below. Now, to truly understand the scale of this sporting tragedy, one must look closely at the sheer financial and athletic market value of the Portuguese generation that peaked between 2018 and 2022. For decades, Portugal was viewed as a small, proud nation that could produce singular, world-class geniuses like Eusebio or Luis Figo, but always lacked the squad depth to compete with the deep, industrial football conveyor belts of France, Germany, or Brazil. But the turn of the decade completely shattered that old historical narrative. Suddenly, the youth academies of Benfica, Sporting Lisbon, and Porto produced a relentless wave of hyper-optimized, modern players who quickly became the most sought-after assets in global football. In every single position on the pitch, Portugal possessed a world-class operator. They had João Cancelo and Nuno Mendes providing explosive, elite full-back play, a midfield anchored by the tireless work rate of Vitinha and the passing range of Ruben Neves, and an attacking front line featuring the raw, devastating pace of Rafael Leao and the clinical efficiency of Diogo Jota. On paper, it was a perfectly balanced matrix of youth, prime athletic experience, and elite tactical education. Yet, despite having a squad that easily rivaled the depth of the iconic French team, Portugal's trophy cabinet during the absolute peak years of this generation remained shockingly empty, save for a solitary Nations League title in 2019. The football they played was consistently described by journalists as sluggish, uninspiring, and painful to watch, characterized by a complete inability to maximize the creative vision of players like Bernardo and Bruno at the exact same time. The tragedy of this golden generation lies in the realization that footballing windows are incredibly brief, and the peak years of world-class athletes are a scarce, non-renewable resource. Portugal entered multiple major tournaments as the undisputed heavyweights on paper, only to leave the pitch in total humiliation, exposed by lesser-valued squads who possessed a clear, unified identity. It is a modern sporting fable that proves having the best pieces on the board means absolutely nothing if the hand moving them is paralyzed by fear and structural division. To understand how a nation possessing an absolute galaxy of attacking and creative football talent could look so visually uninspired on the pitch, one must travel back to the summer of 2016. In France, the Portuguese national team achieved the absolute pinnacle of its sporting history, capturing the European Championship trophy after a grueling, dramatic final against the host nation. It was a beautiful, deeply emotional triumph that united an entire country, but underneath the celebratory champagne and the historic medals lay a very dangerous, long-term institutional trap. The mastermind behind that victory was Fernando Santos, a manager whose entire footballing philosophy was built upon a foundation of extreme pragmatism, defensive rigidity, and tactical safety. In 2016, this ultra-conservative approach was entirely justified. The Portuguese squad at the time was fundamentally limited, relying on aging defenders like Pepe and Ricardo Carvalho, a hard-working but uncreative midfield, and the singular, devastating transitional threat of Cristiano Ronaldo and Nani. Santos understood perfectly that his team could not outplay the elite nations of Europe in an open, expansive contest, so he engineered a system designed to suffocate matches, minimize risks, and rely on defensive resilience to grind out narrow victories. Portugal famously won that tournament while winning only a single match in normal 90-minute regulation time, a statistical anomaly that proved the absolute effectiveness of Santos's defensive blueprint. However, as the years progressed and the calendar turned toward the turn of the decade, the fundamental nature of Portuguese football underwent a massive, revolutionary structural transformation. The youth academies began producing a completely different profile of football player. Suddenly, the national team was no longer a collection of industrial, defensive-minded workhorses. It was populated by some of the most creative, technically gifted, and positionally fluid midfielders and attackers on the planet. Men who were being educated by the absolute finest tactical minds in club football, learning how to dominate possession under Pep Guardiola, how to press high under Jurgen Klopp, and how to operate in complex attacking systems across Europe. But instead of adapting his tactical philosophy to unlock this new, brilliant generation of creative artists, Fernando Santos became a complete prisoner of his own historical success. He treated the defensive blueprint of 2016 as a sacred, unalterable text, completely failing to realize that the chains that once protected a limited team were now actively suffocating a brilliant one. When Portugal stepped onto the pitch in the years that followed, the tactical disconnect was absolutely jarring to witness. Players like Bernardo Silva and Bruno Fernandes, who were celebrated globally for their ability to dictate the tempo of games, slice open defensive lines with intricate passing, and play high-velocity attacking football, were forced to operate in a rigid, deeply conservative system that prioritized caution over creativity. Santos demanded that his creative players spend an immense amount of physical energy tracking back into a deep defensive block, actively forbidding them from taking the calculated risks that made them so dangerous at the club level. The team's transition from defense to attack became painfully slow, predictable, and heavily reliant on individual moments of magic rather than a cohesive collective system. The ghosts of 2016 hung heavily over every single team sheet, creating a bizarre psychological environment where a squad capable of playing beautiful, dominant, front-foot football was actively instructed to play like an underdog fighting for a draw. This systematic suppression of creative freedom did not just limit the team's goal-scoring output, it completely drained the joy and spontaneity from a generation of players who felt structurally handcuffed every time they put on the national jersey. The refusal to evolve the tactical framework meant that Portugal was consistently entering modern international tournaments with a vintage, outdated operational system, trying to run a high-performance modern engine on a restrictive blueprint from a completely different era of football history. The absolute structural failure of this rigid, outdated tactical system became undeniable to the entire world during the summer of 2018, when the eyes of the global football community turned to the stadiums of Russia. Portugal entered the World Cup tournament as the reigning champions of Europe, a status that generated immense public expectation. But the actual reality on the pitch quickly exposed a profound, deeply alarming generational disconnect. By 2018, the old guard that had grinded out the victory in France was fading, and the roster was now heavily injected with the brilliant, ascending talent of Bernardo Silva and a young, highly ambitious Bruno Fernandes. These were two players who had spent the preceding club season operating at the absolute cutting edge of modern European football, redefining the standards of creative midfield play in high-intensity leagues. Yet, the moment they integrated into the international setup, it became painfully obvious that they were being forced into a suffocating tactical cage. Fernando Santos deployed a rigid, inflexible 4-4-2 formation that looked completely ancient, a system that effectively sliced the team into two distinct, isolated halves. The midfield was not designed to dominate possession, press the opposition, or create intricate triangles of fluid movement. Instead, its primary, mandatory function was to sit in a flat, defensive line and protect the back four at all costs. This meant that Bernardo Silva, a player celebrated by Pep Guardiola for his extraordinary spatial awareness and ability to orchestrate attacks in the final third, was completely isolated on the right touchline, forced to chase opposing fullbacks deep into his own half. Bruno Fernandes found himself entirely starved of the ball, trapped in a midfield void where his visionary passing range was completely wasted because the team's entire offensive strategy consisted of launching long, speculative balls over the top. The group stage was a sluggish, anxious struggle, heavily masked by the individual, historic brilliance of Cristiano Ronaldo, who practically dragged the entire nation into the knockout rounds through pure, unadulterated willpower. But when Portugal faced a highly disciplined, physically aggressive Uruguay side in the round of 16 in Sochi, the structural house of cards collapsed completely. The South American team sat in a compact, low defensive block, essentially daring Portugal to use their creative midfielders to unlock the spaces. In that match, the tactical cage became an absolute chokehold. Bernardo and Bruno spent 90 minutes sideways passing, completely stripped of any creative freedom, unable to find vertical passing lanes because the system provided zero off-the-ball movement. The players looked mentally exhausted, physically handcuffed, and completely stripped of the natural, spontaneous joy that defined their club performances. Every time Bernardo tried to cut inside to create, he was met with a complete wall of defensive bodies and absolutely no overlapping support, while Bruno was forced to watch the ball fly completely over his head for the duration of the match. The narrow 2-1 defeat and subsequent elimination from the tournament was a devastating sporting failure, but the true tragedy was the total waste of an entire year of world-class developmental peak. Portugal had the exact creative keys to dismantle any defensive system in the world, but the manager chose to keep those keys firmly locked away in the drawer of tactical caution. It was the first definitive, public proof that the golden generation was actively being suffocated by the very man who was supposed to lead them to glory, a dark warning sign that the institutional leadership of Portuguese football completely refused to heed as they headed into a brand new cycle. As the tactical infrastructure of the Portuguese national team remained firmly frozen in the past, a much larger, deeply complex, and emotionally charged problem began to cast a massive shadow over the entire generation. This was the inevitable, natural athletic evolution of Cristiano Ronaldo, the undisputed titan of Portuguese sports and a historical figure whose influence over the nation's footballing identity was absolute. For over a decade, Ronaldo had been the ultimate cheat code for Portugal, a terrifying force of nature who could single-handedly win matches through raw pace, explosive dribbling, and an unmatched physical dominance that allowed him to shatter international goal-scoring records. But as the calendar turned toward the turn of the decade, the relentless and undefeated laws of human biology began to subtly alter his physical profile. The explosive, dynamic winger who could track back, press defenders, and drift fluidly across the entire attacking frontline was slowly replaced by a much more stationary, localized, and ultra-specialized penalty box predator. While his elite positioning and lethal finishing remained absolutely world-class, his ability to participate in the high-intensity, high-pressing collective build-up that defined modern elite football began to rapidly diminish. This physical transformation created an unprecedented, massive tactical dilemma for the national team, a structural puzzle that the coaching staff completely lacked the courage or the intellectual capacity to solve. In modern football, the top club teams operate as highly synchronized, aggressive machines where every single outfield player must press, defend, and sacrifice themselves for the collective shape of the team. But because of Cristiano Ronaldo's immense historical status, unyielding ambition, and permanent presence on the team sheet, Portugal was forced to operate in a bizarre tactical compromise. The entire offensive system was systematically remolded, altered, and distorted to serve the specific needs of a single individual, rather than maximizing the collective strengths of the entire golden generation. Instead of building a fluid, high-velocity attacking unit around the modern creativity of Bruno Fernandes, Bernardo Silva, and the explosive pace of young wingers, Portugal's primary tactical objective became painfully simple: advance the ball into the final third, and cross it into the box for Ronaldo. This mechanical, highly predictable strategy had a devastating, cascading effect on the rest of the star-studded squad. Creative geniuses who excelled at playing short, intricate combinations and exploiting half spaces found themselves completely starved of options because the central striker was no longer dropping deep to link up play or making decoy runs to open up spaces for his teammates. The entire team became tactically rigid and emotionally paralyzed, playing with a visible, constant anxiety where every single player felt an immense pressure to pass the ball to Ronaldo even when better attacking options were widely available on the pitch. The pitch became a stage for a silent, agonizing conflict between the old world of individual heroism and the new world of collective, high-pressing systems. Ronaldo's physical decline meant that Portugal essentially had to defend with 10 men when out of possession, a fatal flaw against elite nations who could easily exploit the massive defensive gaps in the midfield. Yet his unmatched aura and legendary status meant that questioning his role or altering his minutes was viewed as an act of absolute treason within the institutional walls of Portuguese football. This inability to manage the graceful transition of its greatest icon meant that Portugal was actively sacrificing the absolute prime years of an entire generation of world-class creators, forcing them to play as secondary supporting actors in an outdated, predictable script that the rest of the football world had already learned how to easily defend. The toxic combination of tactical stagnation and the inability to solve the identity crisis of its greatest icon culminated in a deeply agonizing display during the summer of 2021, when the delayed UEFA Euro 2020 tournament finally kicked off across Europe. Portugal entered the competition with a squad that was undeniably, substantially superior in raw talent and depth compared to the group that had miraculously won the trophy 5 years prior. Ruben Dias had just arrived at the tournament fresh from being named the Premier League Player of the Season after completely transforming the defense of Manchester City. Diogo Jota had established himself as a lethal, modern pressing forward under Jurgen Klopp at Liverpool. And Bruno Fernandes had just coming off an extraordinary individual season where he scored 28 goals from midfield for Manchester United. On paper, this was an absolute dream lineup, a modern footballing juggernaut that possessed the precise technical attributes to dominate every phase of play against any opposition. Yet the moment the actual matches began, the entire football world witnessed the continuation of the same structural nightmare. Portugal functioned not as a synchronized elite collective unit, but as a fragmented, deeply confused collection of brilliant individuals who looked like they had met for the very first time in the stadium parking lot just minutes before the opening whistle. The team scraped through a chaotic group stage, relying entirely on moments of individual brilliance, which set up a highly anticipated, massive round of 16 clash against Belgium in the city of Seville. That specific match became the definitive, undeniable historical proof of Portugal's generational waste. The Belgian team, managed by Roberto Martinez, was an aging squad with a deeply vulnerable defensive line that could easily be dismantled by vertical passing and high-velocity, off-the-ball movement. But when a match began, Fernando Santos's Portugal looked completely paralyzed by a profound, systemic fear of losing. The midfield three looked heavy, slow, and entirely disconnected from the attacking trio, creating a massive, empty chasm in the center of the pitch where creativity went to die. Bruno Fernandes, completely exhausted and tactically starved by the rigid defensive instructions, was shockingly dropped to the bench, exposed as a scapegoat for a system that actively prevented him from succeeding. On the pitch, Portugal spent the entire first half passing the ball sideways and backwards in a slow, mechanical rhythm that allowed the Belgian defense to easily shift and close down spaces without exerting any serious physical effort. A single long-range strike from Thorgan Hazard just before halftime put Belgium ahead, and what followed in the second half was a masterclass in pure, unadulterated tactical desperation. Portugal completely abandoned any pretense of a structured modern playing style and resorted to an anarchic barrage of desperate crosses and long-range shots. The players looked visibly frantic, arguing with one another on the pitch as the minutes ticked away. When the final whistle blew, sealing a painful 1-0 elimination, the statistics showed that Portugal had taken 23 shots but failed to score a single goal, a damning testament to a complete lack of collective chemistry and offensive patterns. It was a terrifyingly hollow performance that sent a wave of profound disappointment across the entire nation. Portugal had the finest individual ingredients in the entire tournament, but they lacked a modern, cohesive recipe. The elimination proved that a team built entirely on historical gratitude and tactical caution will always desmorone when confronted by a unified opponent, leaving a generation of world-class creators to watch the rest of the tournament from their television screens while their absolute physical prime evaporated into the Spanish night. The profound structural and tactical decay that was actively sabotaging the absolute finest generation of Portuguese football players finally pushed the entire nation to the very edge of a historic, unprecedented sporting catastrophe on November 14, 2021. The setting was the iconic, deafening Estadio da Luz in Lisbon, where Portugal faced Serbia in the final, decisive group stage match of the European qualifiers for the upcoming World Cup in Qatar. Portugal held the absolute mathematical advantage. They were playing at home in front of over 65,000 screaming, passionate supporters, and they only needed a simple draw to secure their direct flight to the tournament. The match started like an absolute dream when Renato Sanches scored a powerful, explosive goal after just 2 minutes of play, sending the entire stadium into a state of pure euphoria. But what followed that opening goal was a 90-minute display of tactical cowardice, systematic panic, and collective paralysis that will forever remain a dark stain on the history of the national team. Instead of using their immense talent to dictate the tempo, dominate possession, and completely bury a vulnerable Serbian team, Fernando Santos ordered his players to immediately retreat into an ultra-defensive, low-block fortress. For nearly 88 minutes, world-class creative geniuses like Bernardo Silva, Bruno Fernandes, and João Cancelo were forced to play like terrified underdogs, desperately kicking the ball away and defending their own penalty box against a relentless wave of Serbian attacks. The equalizer came before halftime, and as the clock ticked away into the final minutes of the match, the inevitable structural collapse arrived. In the 90th minute, Serbian striker Aleksandar Mitrovic was left completely unmarked at the back post, a fatal defensive breakdown that allowed him to plant a devastating, precise header past the diving goalkeeper. Before we examine the terrifying psychological aftermath of this historic loss and the total desespero that engulfed the squad, please do me a massive favor. If you believe that a manager who forces world-class attacking players to play with a permanent fear of losing deserves to be held accountable by the fans, click that subscribe button right now, hit the like button to show your support, and leave a comment below sharing if you think Portugal should have sacked their coaching staff long before this qualification disaster occurred. We highly value your insights, so join the community archive down below. Now, the moment that final whistle blew in Lisbon, sealing a shocking 2-1 victory for Serbia, the stadium fell into an absolute, haunting silence. Portugal had failed to qualify directly for the World Cup, forced instead to face the unpredictable, high-stakes terror of the playoff brackets where single bad bounce of the ball could eliminate them entirely. The live television cameras captured a chilling, powerful image that perfectly summarized the toxic climate within the national setup. Cristiano Ronaldo was sitting completely flat on the grass in total disbelief, shaking his head in absolute fury. When Fernando Santos walked onto the pitch to console his legendary captain, Ronaldo openly gesticulated at him, screaming in frustration and refusing to look his manager in the eye, exposing a massive, deep fracture in the psychological foundation of the team. The defeat was an absolute tactical masterclass in how to completely waste a golden generation through systemic caution. Portugal had a squad that valued hundreds of millions of euros, yet they were thoroughly outplayed, out-hustled, and tactically dismantled on their own home turf by a nation with a fraction of their footballing resources. The team looked completely broken, stripped of any clear identity, and deeply traumatized by a manager who consistently forced them to play with a handbrake pulled tightly against their natural instincts. It was the absolute rock bottom of a long cycle of stagnation, a structural warning shot that sent shockwaves through the entire global football community and proved that no matter how many superstars you have on your team sheet, tactical fear will always lead to a catastrophic collapse. The deep tactical and psychological fractures within the Portuguese national team were pushed to an absolute breaking point in the final weeks leading up to the 2022 FIFA World Cup in Qatar. The catalyst for this unprecedented internal crisis did not originate on a training pitch in Lisbon, but rather inside a television studio across the English Channel in Manchester. Cristiano Ronaldo, facing a sudden and highly public demotion to the bench at Manchester United under manager Erik ten Hag, decided to unleash a bombastic, scorched-earth television interview that completely shattered the global sports landscape. While the interview was intended to defend his personal pride, Its timing was absolute poison for the Portuguese national team, which was preparing to gather for the biggest tournament on Earth. Within 48 hours of the broadcast, the toxic, heavily media-driven drama surrounding Ronaldo's club situation completely bled into the international camp, creating a heavy, suffocating atmosphere of tension that the players could not escape. The entire global sports media apparatus descended upon Portugal's training base, completely ignoring the upcoming World Cup tactical preparations to focus exclusively on every single movement, glance, and physical gesture made by the legendary captain. The psychological tipping point was captured in a viral, highly analyzed video clip released by the Portuguese Football Federation itself, inside the locker room. The footage showed a young Bruno Fernandes, who was actively starring alongside Ronaldo at Manchester United, arriving at the international camp and sharing a deeply awkward, frosty, and brief handshake with his legendary captain. Although both players later attempted to downplay the incident as a simple, light-hearted joke between teammates, the visual body language told a completely different, unsettling story to millions of viewers worldwide. A similar moment of visible friction occurred on the training pitch between Ronaldo and a young João Cancelo, exposing a profound, underlying nervousness within the squad. For the very first time in his legendary 20-year career, Cristiano Ronaldo was entering a major tournament not as an undisputed, unifying heroic figure, but as a massive, deeply polarizing distraction who was actively dominating the daily headlines. The young, golden generation of Portuguese players, who had spent their entire lives treating Ronaldo as an untouchable idol, were suddenly forced to navigate a toxic media minefield, repeatedly defending their captain in press conferences instead of focusing on their tactical roles. Bruno Fernandes and Bernardo Silva found themselves in an impossible psychological position, trying to establish themselves as the true on-pitch leaders of the team, while remaining under the massive, towering shadow of a disgruntled superstar. The team's tactical environment became completely compromised by this off-pitch drama. Fernando Santos, already struggling to manage the complex transition of his aging striker, now had to deal with a fractured locker room where the club rivalries and personal frustrations of Manchester were actively poisoning the collective chemistry of the nation. The beautiful game was completely hijacked by a non-stop reality television circus, ensuring that when Portugal finally boarded the plane to Qatar, they were not operating as a unified, laser-focused army, but as a deeply stressed, emotionally exhausted collection of stars carrying an immense weight of controversy that would inevitably explode under the high-pressure lights of the World Cup. The escalating operational and psychological tension surrounding the Portuguese national camp finally culminated in one of the most daring, shocking, and universally historic tactical decisions ever witnessed in the modern history of the FIFA World Cup. On December 6, 2022, Portugal was scheduled to face a highly disciplined, physically menacing Switzerland side in a high-stakes round of 16 knockout match at the Lusail iconic stadium. When the official team sheets were printed and distributed to the global sports media just over an hour before the opening whistle, an absolute shockwave of pure disbelief reverberated through the global press box and across social media platforms worldwide. Fernando Santos, a manager historically defined by his unyielding conservatism and absolute loyalty to his veteran core, had done the unthinkable. He officially dropped Cristiano Ronaldo to the substitute bench, stripping him of his starting spot for the very first time in a major international tournament since the distant summer of 2004. This monumental decision followed Ronaldo's visible, angry outburst upon being substituted in the final group stage match against South Korea, a public display of disrespect that finally forced the coaching staff to prioritize the structural integrity of the collective unit over the fragile ego of its greatest icon. In his place, Santos deployed Goncalo Ramos, a 21-year-old, highly energetic, and positionally dynamic forward from Benfica who embodied the modern, high-pressing playing style that Ronaldo could no longer physically provide. What followed on the pristine pitch of Lusail was an absolute, blinding revelation that completely exposed the tragic waste of the preceding years. Without the static, towering presence of Ronaldo forcing every single offensive sequence to channel through a predictable target, the true, unrestricted brilliance of Portugal's golden generation was finally unlocked for the entire world to see. The team transformed instantly from a sluggish, anxious collection of individuals into a fluid, terrifyingly fast, and synchronized attacking machine. Bruno Fernandes operated with an extraordinary creative freedom, dropping deep to dictate play and executing defense-splitting passes with absolute precision, while Bernardo Silva orchestrated brilliant, intricate triangles of movement in the half spaces. The young Goncalo Ramos shocked the global audience by scoring a spectacular, clinical hat trick, demonstrating the exact type of relentless off-the-ball movement, aggressive pressing, and spatial manipulation that allowed his fellow creative midfielders to thrive. Portugal completely dismantled and humiliated Switzerland in an overwhelming 6-1 victory, playing a beautiful, dominant, and front-foot brand of football that had been systematically suppressed for an entire decade under the handbrake of tactical fear. The match stood as a definitive, unassailable historical proof that the incredible depth of talent within the squad was not the problem. The problem was the rigid insistence on a system that had spent years holding this generation hostage to serve a vintage blueprint. The global football community watched in awe as the young Portuguese stars smiled, combined with spontaneity, and dictated the match with absolute authority, proving that when the structural chains were removed, they were fully capable of playing the most devastating football on the planet. Yet even amidst this historic triumph, the heavy shadow of the bench loomed large over the stadium, setting up a complex, hyper-fragile psychological landscape for the remaining rounds of the tournament, as the world watched to see if Portugal could maintain this collective harmony, or if the internal divisions would rise again to destroy their ultimate dream. The absolute, blinding euphoria of the historic victory over Switzerland proved to be a tragically brief and fleeting illusion, lasting just 4 days before Portugal's golden generation was forced to confront the ultimate, devastating dead end of their international cycle. On December 10, 2022, the team stepped onto the pitch of the Al Thumama Stadium to face Morocco, a nation that had already shocked the world by eliminating Spain through a masterclass of defensive resilience, physical sacrifice, and collective unity. Fernando Santos opted to retain the exact same starting lineup that had played so fluidly against the Swiss, leaving Cristiano Ronaldo firmly on the substitute bench for the second consecutive match. But the psychological and tactical environment of this quarterfinal was fundamentally, entirely different. Switzerland had attempted to play an open, expansive game that handed Portugal massive spaces to exploit. Morocco, conversely, erected a terrifyingly compact, low-block fortress, suffocating every single millimeter of space in the final third and daring the Portuguese stars to break them down. From the very first minute, the deep, historical flaws of Portugal's tactical preparation were completely exposed. The fluid, high-velocity attacking movements that had dismantled the Swiss completely evaporated, replaced by a slow, mechanical, and highly anxious sideways passing rhythm that played directly into the hands of the African defense. Bruno Fernandes and Bernardo Silva spent the entire first half completely blocked from finding vertical passing lanes, forced to watch their teammates recycle possession across the backline without any aggressive off-the-ball penetration. Just before halftime, a catastrophic defensive miscommunication between goalkeeper Diogo Costa and Ruben Dias allowed Moroccan forward Youssef Ennaciri to soar into the air and plant a powerful header into the empty net, putting Portugal behind and sparking an absolute psychological panic within the squad. In the second half, the structural limitations of Fernando Santos's tactical philosophy reached their ultimate, tragic manifestation. With his team facing immediate elimination, the manager completely abandoned any pretense of a modern, organized playing system and threw his players into a state of chaotic, unadulterated desperation. He substituted Cristiano Ronaldo onto the pitch in the 51st minute, but instead of creating space, this move simply triggered a vintage, predictable reflex. The team completely stopped trying to play through the creative vision of its midfielders and reverted entirely to a primitive, relentless barrage of desperate crosses into the Moroccan penalty box, a strategy that the towering, heroic African center-backs easily cleared away minute after minute. Bruno Fernandes desperately struck the crossbar with a brilliant, long-range effort, and João Felix saw a spectacular shot saved by the goalkeeper, but these were isolated flashes of individual desperation rather than the product of a functioning collective engine. The young Portuguese stars looked visibly frantic, arguing with one another on the pitch as the minutes rapidly ticked away. When the final whistle blew, sealing a historic 1-0 elimination, the golden generation was left completely broken, exposed to the global audience as a multi-million-dollar collection of famous individuals who lacked the collective chemistry, the tactical maturity, and the structural identity to overcome a truly unified opponent. It was a heartbreaking, definitive end to a cycle that should have yielded a world championship, a stark historical monument to how easily an abundance of raw sporting talent can be completely wasted when a federation permits institutional caution and managerial fear to dictate its ultimate destiny on the world's biggest stage. The devastating, historic failure in the sands of Qatar marked the absolute end of an entire era, forcing the Portuguese Football Federation to finally sever its long-term ties with Fernando Santos. In his place, the governing body made a highly scrutinized, massive institutional appointment by hiring the Spanish tactician Roberto Martinez, the man who had previously overseen the rise and subsequent trophyless decline of Belgium's own celebrated golden generation. Martinez arrived in Lisbon promising a radical, breath of fresh air transformation, explicitly vowing to dismantle the rigid defensive chains of the past and replace them with a highly expansive, dominant, and front-foot attacking philosophy that would completely unlock the unrestricted creative brilliance of the nation's world-class stars. To a public that was deeply traumatized by years of systematic caution, his initial tactical adjustments felt like an absolute dream come true. During the qualifying campaign for the UEFA Euro 2024 tournament in Germany, Portugal looked like an unstoppable, terrifying global juggernaut, steamrolling through their group to achieve a flawless, historic record of 10 consecutive victories while scoring a staggering 36 goals and conceding just 2. Bruno Fernandes was deployed as the absolute tactical epicenter of the team, flourishing with an extraordinary freedom that allowed him to finish the qualifying cycle as the top assist provider in the entire European continent. Bernardo Silva orchestrated play with his trademark spatial perfection, while the explosive, raw pace of young wingers like Rafael Leão and the clinical efficiency of a rejuvenated Cristiano Ronaldo, who was retained by Martinez as a focal point, seemed to suggest that the structural identity crisis had been permanently resolved. The global sports media quickly flooded the team with immense praise, labeling Portugal as the undisputed, terrifying favorite to capture the upcoming trophy. However, underneath the brilliant, shining surface of these statistical triumphs lay a very dangerous, deep, and highly deceptive illusion. The reality that many tactical analysts pointed out was that Portugal's qualification group was exceptionally weak, consisting of nations like Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, and Bosnia, opponents whose total lack of defensive depth allowed the individual superiority of the Portuguese stars to shine without being subjected to any serious collective stress or intense high-pressing systems. Martinez's tactical flexibility, which looked so fluid on paper, was never truly tested under real-world, high-stakes pressure. The new manager chose to maintain the exact same unwavering, absolute reliance on the veteran core, carefully avoiding the politically explosive, delicate task of managing the natural transition of Cristiano Ronaldo's role within the squad. As the team packed their bags and boarded the plane for Germany in the summer of 2024, the entire nation was enveloped in a state of profound optimism, completely blind to the fact that the very same structural fractures, the same tactical compromises, and the same underlying anxieties that had sabotaged them in Russia and Qatar were still silently lingering inside the locker room, waiting to violently re-emerge the moment they confronted an elite European opponent. The absolute fragility of Roberto Martinez's qualifying illusion was violently, completely shattered during the summer of 2024 when Portugal faced the elite, unforgiving realities of the European Championship knockout rounds on German soil. As the tournament progressed into the deep, high-stakes matches, the tactical flexibility that the Spanish manager had promised quickly evaporated, replaced by a rigid, deeply controversial obsession that completely paralyzed the team's offensive fluidness. Martinez committed the exact same institutional error as his predecessor, refusing to alter, manage, or reduce the minutes of a 39-year-old Cristiano Ronaldo, who was deployed as an absolute, unmovable starter for the entirety of every single match. In modern, high-velocity international football, a central striker must possess the physical dynamism to execute relentless pressing, make explosive decoy runs, and actively participate in the collective build-up play to break down disciplined defensive blocks. But Ronaldo's physical profile in 2024 meant that he remained almost entirely localized within the penalty box, forcing his world-class teammates to operate in a highly compromised structural framework. The tactical consequences were absolutely devastating for the rest of Portugal's golden generation. Young explosive attacking stars like Rafael Leão and Diogo Jota found their natural instincts completely suppressed because the entire offensive strategy of the team was systematically funneled into a predictable, repetitive pattern of launching desperate crosses into the box from the touchlines. During the agonizing round of 16 match against an incredibly stubborn Slovenia side, the entire world witnessed a collective unit that looked completely trapped inside a psychological prison. Bruno Fernandes and Bernardo Silva spent 120 minutes recycling possession sideways, completely unable to orchestrate their trademark vertical passing combinations because the central areas were entirely static. Ronaldo missed a crucial penalty in extra time, triggering an emotional breakdown on the pitch that further heightened the immense tension surrounding the squad. Although Portugal managed to scrape through to the quarterfinals thanks to the historic penalty saves of goalkeeper Diogo Costa, the structural system collapsed completely when they faced a highly organized, elite French side in Hamburg. In that decisive match, the tactical imbalance reached its ultimate manifestation. Portugal essentially defended and pressed with 10 men when out of possession, creating massive, empty chasms in the midfield that forced Bruno and Bernardo to exert an immense amount of physical energy running backwards rather than creating attacks. Martinez refused to substitute his aging captain, leaving dynamic, high-performance forward options on the bench for the duration of the grueling contest. Portugal played through another full 2 hours of football without scoring a single goal from open play, a damning, undeniable testament to a complete lack of collective patterns and offensive identity. The subsequent elimination on penalty kicks was a cold, logical conclusion to a campaign defined by institutional fear. The Golden Generation had traveled to Germany with arguably the deepest, most terrifyingly talented roster in the entire continent, but they were forced to exit the tournament in total silence, their absolute prime years once again traded away to maintain a vintage, individualistic narrative that the modern game had completely left behind. When historians look back at the historical arch of international football, the era spanning from 2018 to 2024 will always be remembered as one of the most fascinating, tragic, and profoundly educational chapters in the history of the sport. We have traveled from the modern tactical cage of Russia to the absolute psychological breakdown in the desert of Qatar, and finally to the painful, static obsession that paralyzed the team under the bright lights of Germany. This comprehensive journey through the recent archives of the beautiful game reveals a deeply chilling, undeniable reality about the nature of elite sports. Raw athletic talent, immense financial market value, and a roster populated by the most celebrated superstars of the English Premier League and European football mean absolutely nothing if a national federation lacks the institutional courage to build a cohesive, collective identity. Portugal produced a hyper-optimized generation of creative geniuses who were actively redefining the tactical standards of the modern game under the finest club managers on earth, yet they permitted that golden harvest to be systematically dismantled by a toxic combination of managerial fear, outdated pragmatism, and dressing room politics. The tragedy of this squandered kingdom lies in the realization that international football windows are incredibly brief, and the peak years of world-class creators are a scarce, non-renewable resource that will never return. Before we close this epic archive and deliver our final verdict on this generation, I absolutely need your help to settle this massive debate. If you made it all the way to the end of this intense documentary, you are a true, dedicated football fanatic. Smash that subscribe button right now to join our growing community. Hit the like button to show your support for the channel, and leave a comment below giving me your absolute honest opinion. Who do you think bears the ultimate, primary responsibility for completely wasting the peak years of this historic squad? Was it the rigid tactical caution of Fernando Santos, the political compromises of Roberto Martinez, or did the towering, unyielding shadow of Cristiano Ronaldo's sunset years simply make it impossible for a true collective team to exist on the pitch? Let us start a massive, respectful debate down in the comment section, because we actively read and reply to every single one of them. What we can say for certain right now is that the modern pitch remains a grand, uncompromising theater where human excellence and structural vulnerability coexist in their most volatile forms. The failure of Portugal's greatest generation stands as a permanent warning sign to every single football association across the globe, proving that a team built entirely on historical gratitude, individual sentimentality, and structural fear will always desmorona when confronted by a unified, modern opponent. The elite athletes who put on that jersey gave their absolute physical prime to the nation, but they were ultimately left stranded by a system that refused to evolve with the times. The archive of football history has officially closed this chapter, leaving us to wonder what could have been if these brilliant artists had simply been given the freedom to play without their chains. Thank you so much for watching. Keep the channel alive by subscribing, and we will see you next time on the Football Archive.